All right, so are you ready to jump into this deep dive into the Russian way of war?
Absolutely. I think it's a fascinating topic and one that's more relevant than ever.
Yeah, don't kidding. Especially with everything going on in the world today. So we've got some excerpts from a 2017 report titled The Russian Way of War, Force Structure, Tactics, and Modernization of the Russian Ground Forces by Lester W. Grau and Charles K. Bartels.
And it's a really dense report, packed with information. But don't worry, we're going to break it down for you.
Yeah, we'll try to hit the high points and really give you a sense of the key takeaways. So what's the big picture here? When we talk about the Russian way of war, what are we really talking about?
Well, I think it's about understanding their mindset, how they see the world, how they approach conflict.
Okay, so it's not just about tanks and guns. It's about the thinking behind it all.
Exactly. It's about their history, their culture, their worldview. All of that shapes how they fight wars.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture. So where do we even begin with unpacking something this complex?
Well, let's start with something kind of unique, how they prepare their soldiers, even before they enlist.
Before they enlist?
Yeah.
You mean like some kind of pre-boot camp?
Yeah, exactly. They have this organization called DOSAAF.
DOSAAF. I'm not familiar with that. What is it?
It's a civilian organization, but it has deep ties to the military. And they provide training in all sorts of skills, shooting, parachuting, driving, even things like radio operation and map reading.
Wow. So they're getting a head start on their military training before they even sign up.
Exactly. Imagine 40% of your recruits showing up on day one already having a military specialty.
That's incredible. Is that common in other countries?
Not to this extent, no. And here's where it gets even more interesting. DOSAAF actually has a representative on the draft boards.
Really? So they're not just teaching skills. They're actively helping to match those skills with the needs of the military.
Right. It's a very streamlined system. They're not just throwing bodies at the problem. They're strategically developing personnel from a young age.
That's impressive.
Hmm.
So this DOSAF thing, it's almost like a talent pipeline for the military.
You could say that. And it feeds directly into how the Russian General Staff, the brains behind their military planning, approaches different levels of war.
You mean like tactical, operational, strategic?
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yes. But they don't see those levels as fixed. For them, it's not just about the size of the unit, it's about the scope of the mission.
So a brigade could be operating at the tactical level one day and then be bumped up to the operational level the next.
Depending on what they're trying to achieve.
Exactly. It's very fluid. Not rigid like some other militaries.
So adaptability is key for them.
Absolutely. They have to be able to adjust to a wide range of challenges. And that goes for their reserves, too.
Reserves.
How so?
Well, they have this two-pronged system that blends the old and the new. On the one hand, they maintain a massive strategic reserve. Think hundreds of thousands of troops ready for full mobilization in a major war.
So that's the classic Russian approach. Mass mobilization like they did in World War II.
Right. But they're not stuck in the past. They're also developing a smaller, more agile operational reserve. Think of it as a rapid reaction force, ready to deploy quickly to hotspots.
So it's like having a big hammer and a scalpel. Each tool for a different job.
A good analogy. They need to be able to respond to a wide range of threats, from small-scale conflicts to full-blown war.
It's all making sense now, this idea of adaptability being woven into everything they do.
And it even extends to their pay system, believe it or not.
Their pay system.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm really curious. How does that work?
Well, it's complicated. Base pay is just the starting point. On top of that, there's a whole stack of entitlements and allowances that can significantly boost a soldier's income.
So it's not just a flat salary. There are all these variables that factor in.
Exactly. And it's all very strategic. They use it to incentivize certain skills, compensate for hardships, acknowledge things like family size, years of service.
So it's more than just compensation. It's a tool for shaping the force.
Precisely. And speaking of shaping the force, we should talk about women as the Russian military.
Oh, yeah. That's an interesting topic. I've heard there's some pretty big cultural differences there compared to the U.S.
You're right. The imagery can be a little jarring. You might see women in high heels and field uniforms. It's a very different approach.
So what's the message they're sending with that?
It's complex. On one hand, it's about maintaining a sense of femininity while serving, but it also raises questions about how deeply integrated women are into the culture of the Russian military.
That's a good point. It's not just about putting women in uniform. It's about how they're treated, how they're perceived within the institution.
Right, and that's something we need to keep in mind as we dig deeper into their training and tactics.
Okay, so we've talked about their personnel system, their approach to reserves, their pay structure. Now let's talk about how they've actually modernized their forces
Yeah.
since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Well, they went through a major overhaul back in 2008 with what they called the New Look reforms.
The New Look reforms.
Yeah.
What was the impetus for that?
Well, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were left with this big, bloated, inefficient military structure.
A relic of the Cold War.
Exactly. And it wasn't suited for the kind of conflicts they were facing in the 21st century.
So they needed to streamline things,
Yeah.
become more agile.
Right. The New Look reforms were all about creating a leaner, meaner fighting force that could deploy quickly and adapt to different types of missions.
And what was the key change in terms of unit structure?
They shifted their focus to independent brigades as their primary combat unit. These brigades are more self-sufficient and flexible than the old divisions.
So they can operate independently without a lot of support.
Right. They can deploy quickly, sustain themselves in the field, and adapt to a wide range of tasks.
And this new structure was really put to the test in Georgia in 2008.
Right? Absolutely. That conflict exposed the weaknesses of their old system, and it highlighted the need for a more adaptable and rapidly deployable force, which is where the Battalion Tactical Group comes in, the BTG.
Yes, the BTG. The infamous BTG. Everyone's talking about it these days. What is it exactly?
Well, it's essentially a task-organized unit built around a core of motorized infantry. But they add in tanks, artillery air defense, other elements as needed.
So it's like a mini combined arms army.
You could say that. It's very modular and adaptable. They can tailor a BTG for offensive operations, defensive operations, peacekeeping, counterinsurgency.
So it's like a Swiss Army knife. They can do it all.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And they're very good using it.
And a key factor in their ability to deploy these BTGs so effectively is their mastery of rail logistics.
Ah, yes. The railroads. The iron web of the Russian bear.
Why are railroads so important for them?
Well, think about the size of Russia. They have to move troops and equipment over vast distances, and rail is the most efficient way to do that.
So it's not just about transportation, it's about speed and efficiency of deployment.
Exactly. They've turned it into an art form, constantly practicing loading and unloading entire brigades and their equipment.
That's wild. So they can basically move an army across the country in a matter of days.
More or less. And this emphasis on speed ties directly into their defensive doctrine.
Defensive doctrine.
Oh,
Okay, I'm intrigued. How do they approach defense?
They have a very proactive and aggressive approach. They call it hold, shape, destroy.
Hold, shape, destroy. I like the sound of that. Tell me more.
Well, it's about more than just holding a line. They believe in aggressive reconnaissance, using their reserves to channel the enemy's advance.
So they're not just sitting back and waiting for the enemy to come to them.
Well, they're actively trying to shake the battlefield to their advantage.
And then they hit them with a decisive counterattack.
Exactly. They aim to obliterate any incursion, not just stop it.
So it's a very fluid and dynamic approach to defense.
Very much so. And a lot of this thinking can be traced back to the work of a single man, Major General Ivan Vorobyov.
Vorobyov.
Who was he? He was a decorated World War II veteran and a prolific military writer. He had a profound impact on Russian tactical thinking.
What were some of his key ideas?
Well, he was a big believer in combined arms combat, the idea of using all elements of the military in a coordinated way.
And he was also a pioneer in night fighting, wasn't he?
He recognized the importance of being able to fight effectively at night.
To take advantage of the darkness, to disorient the enemy.
Exactly. And he was also ahead of his time in recognizing the importance of the information dimension of warfare.
Information warfare. This sounds very 21st century. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's about controlling the narrative, using deception propaganda, electronic warfare to disrupt the enemy's decision-making.
So it's not just about physical force. It's about using information as a weapon.
Right. And these ideas are reflected in how they design their defensive positions.
Defensive positions. How so?
They create these layered, integrated systems of fire and obstacles that are specifically designed to funnel the enemy into kill zones.
Kill zones. That sounds pretty ominous. What does that look like on the ground?
Think carefully placed minefields,
Your left.
interlocking fields of fire from machine guns and anti-tank weapons, concealed positions for snipers. Every element is designed to work together to create a deadly web.
So it's not just about firepower. It's about using terrain and obstacles to your advantage.
Right. It's a very calculated and meticulous approach.
And then on the offense, it's a completely different story.
Yes. On offense, they're all about speed. Surprise, overwhelming force. They want to hit the enemy hard and fast before they have a chance to react.
So they're very adaptable.
Yeah.
They can switch gears depending on the situation.
Absolutely. And these principles apply even when they're fighting in some of the most challenging environments on Earth.
Like the mountains of Afghanistan.
Exactly. Afghanistan was a real crucible for them. They learned a lot of hard lessons there about how to adapt their tactics to a completely different kind of warfare.
Okay, let's talk about Afghanistan. What did they learn there that's still relevant today?
Well, they learned the hard way that you can't just fight the same way everywhere. You have to adapt your tactics to the terrain and the enemy.
Yeah, mountains are a different beast altogether, I imagine.
Totally. Different rules of engagement. They had to learn to use flanking detachments, to use the terrain to their advantage, to outmaneuver the enemy.
So a lot of emphasis on maneuver warfare.
Right. And they also had to get much better at coordinating fire support, using artillery and airstrikes to pinpoint enemy positions in those rugged valleys.
I bet that was tough.
It was. They had to learn on the fly, and they made a lot of mistakes, but they also learned some valuable lessons that they've applied in other conflicts since then.
Like in Ukraine.
Exactly. Ukraine has a lot of similar terrain features, so the lessons they learned in Afghanistan have been very relevant there.
Makes sense. So they learned about the importance of adaptability, the need to tailor their tactics to the specific environment.
Right. And that's something they've carried forward into their training and doctrine.
Okay, so we talked about Afghanistan. Now let's circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the idea of replacing units in contact with the enemy. What's their process for what they call relief in place?
It's a tricky maneuver, especially when you're under fire. But the Russians have a very specific process for it, one that emphasizes meticulous planning and attention to detail.
I can imagine. Any mistakes could be disastrous.
Absolutely. So they start with thorough reconnaissance.
Yeah.
They want to get a clear picture of the enemy's positions and any potential threats.
So it's not just about swapping out troops. It's about maintaining situational awareness.
Right. They want to make sure the incoming unit has all the information they need to take over the fight seamlessly.
So there's a lot of coordination involved.
Tons of it. They have detailed map handovers, familiarization tours for vehicle crews to learn the routes and markers, procedures for transferring critical information about the enemy's tactics and behavior.
It sounds like a well-oiled machine.
Well, they try to make it that way, because any slip-ups could cost lives.
That makes sense.
Yes.
Okay, so relief in place is one thing, but what about a situation where a unit gets completely surrounded by the enemy? What do they call that? Encirclement.
That's it. And it's every commander's nightmare. But the Russians actually have a playbook for it.
Really? They train for that specifically?
They do. It's all about maximizing their chances of survival and breakout.
So what's the strategy?
Well, they focus on securing key terrain, establishing a strong anti-tank reserve to repel any armed assaults, and coordinating with external forces to punch a hole in the encirclement.
So they're not just hunkering down and waiting to be rescued?
No. They're actively fighting their way out, while also trying to hold on to as much territory as possible.
So it's a balancing act.
Yeah.
Between defense and offense.
Exactly. And they instill this mindset in their troops. The idea that even when surrounded, they're not defeated. They still have a mission to accomplish.
That's a powerful message to give your soldiers.
It is. And it's essential for maintaining morale in a desperate situation.
Okay, so we've talked about conventional warfare. But what about the elephant in the room? Tactical nuclear weapons.
Ah, yes. The nukes. It's a topic that's hard to talk about, but it's one that we can't ignore.
Especially when it comes to Russia.
Right. They have a large arsenal of tactical nuclear weapons, and their doctrine for using them has evolved over time.
How so?
Well, during the Cold War, they saw nuclear weapons as primarily a strategic deterrent, but now they're thinking about them more in a tactical context.
Tactical meaning?
Meaning they might use them on the battlefield to achieve a specific military objective.
Like to break up a large enemy formation.
Or to destroy a key command and control node. Or to take out a critical piece of infrastructure.
It's a scary thought.
It is. And it's a very controversial topic, but it's one that we need to be aware of.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the tools of the trade. What are some of the key weapons that Russian foot soldiers rely on?
Well, their primary weapon is the AK-74 assault rifle.
Ah, yes. The AK, good old reliable.
It's a simple but effective weapon, rugged, easy to use, and it's been battle-tested in countless conflicts.
It's iconic, too. Everyone recognizes that distinctive shape.
For sure. And they also use the RPK light machine gun for suppressive fire, and the RPG-7 anti-tank grenade launcher for taking out armored vehicles.
So they have a pretty good mix of firepower.
They do, and they're also very good at using snipers.
Snipers, I've heard they have some really skilled marksmen.
They do. They put a lot of emphasis on marksmanship training, and they have some very effective sniper rifles, like the Dragunov SVD.
That's the one with the big scope.
That's the one. It's a semi-automatic rifle designed for long-range accuracy.
So they can take out targets from a distance.
Exactly. And that gives them an advantage on the battlefield, especially in defensive situations.
Okay, so we've talked about infantry. Now let's talk about tanks. What are the big boys in their arsenal?
Well, their main battle tank is the T-72. It's a workhorse tank that's been produced in massive numbers.
So they have a lot of them.
They do, and they're constantly upgrading them to keep them relevant on the modern battlefield.
So what are some of the upgrades they've made?
Well, they've improved the armor, they've added new fire control systems, they've upgraded the engines.
So they're making them more survivable, more lethal.
Exactly, and they're also developing new tanks, like the T-14 Armada.
The Armada, I've heard that's a next-generation tank.
It is. It's supposed to be a game changer, but it's still in development.
So we'll have to wait and see how it performs.
We will. But in the meantime, they're also focusing on tank support vehicles.
Yeah.
Like the BMPT Terminator.
The Terminator? That sounds pretty badass. What is it?
It's a heavily armed and armored vehicle designed to accompany tanks into urban areas.
So it's like a bodyguard for the tanks.
Yeah, you could say that. It's designed to clear out enemy infantry and other threats that tanks are vulnerable to in close quarters.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Tanks aren't exactly nimble.
No, they're not. And they can be easy targets for infantry with anti-tank weapons. So the Terminator is there to provide close-in fire support.
Okay, so tanks are one thing, but what about artillery? I know that's always been a big part of the Russian way of war.
It is. They call it the god of war.
And for good reason, artillery can be devastating.
It can. They have a wide array of artillery systems, from self-propelled howitzers to multiple launch rocket systems.
So they can deliver a lot of firepower.
They can, and they're very good at coordinating their artillery fire with their maneuver units.
So it's not just about indiscriminate bombardment.
No, it's about using artillery in a very precise and targeted way to support their ground troops.
Okay, so artillery is still king. But what about the other stuff? Electronic warfare, cyber warfare. Are they making progress in those areas?
They are. They've been investing heavily in electronic warfare capabilities in recent years.
Why is that?
Well, they learned some hard lessons in Georgia in 2008 when their communications were disrupted by Jordan electronic warfare.
So they realized they needed to catch up.
They did. And they've made significant strides since then. They now have a wide array of jamming systems and other electronic countermeasures.
So they can disrupt enemy communications, blind their radars.
Exactly. And they're also developing cyber warfare capabilities.
Cyber warfare.
Yeah.
That's a whole other can of worms.
It is, but it's one that's becoming increasingly important in modern warfare.
So they're trying to stay ahead of the curve.
They are, and they're not afraid to use these capabilities to achieve their objectives.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of high-tech stuff. But what about the basics? What about the combat engineers? The guys who build bridges, clear minefields, that sort of thing.
Combat engineers are essential for any military, and the Russians have some very capable engineer units.
What kind of equipment do they use?
Well, they have the UR-77 Meteorite mine-clearing vehicle, which uses a rocket-projected explosive charge to create a safe path through minefields.
That sounds pretty intense.
It is. And they also have the BAT-2 Heavy Armored Engineer Vehicle, which is basically a bulldozer on steroids.
So they're well equipped to handle any engineering challenge.
They are. And all of this, of course, relies on a well-oiled logistical system.
Logistics, the lifeblood of any military. How do the Russians approach logistics?
They use what's known as a push logistics system, which means that supplies are constantly being moved forward to anticipated points of need.
So they're not waiting for units to request supplies.
No, they're proactively pushing supplies forward to make sure the troops have what they need when they need it.
That's a smart approach,
Yeah.
especially in a large country like Russia.
It is, but it also has its challenges. Any interruptions in the flow of supplies could have serious consequences.
That's true. Okay, so we've talked about the ground forces. Now let's talk about some of their more specialized units, like the airborne and the naval infantry.
The airborne, or VDV, are their elite paratroopers. They're highly trained and well-equipped, and they're often used for rapid deployments and high-risk missions.
So they're like the tip of the spear.
You could say that. And then you have the naval infantry, which are basically their version of the Marines.
So they specialize in amphibious operations.
Right. And they're also trained for coastal defense and Arctic warfare.
Arctic warfare.
Yeah.
That's something we haven't talked about yet. But it's becoming increasingly important for them, isn't it?
It is. The Arctic is a region of growing strategic importance, and the Russians are taking steps to assert their presence there.
So they're building new bases, deploying specialized units, conducting exercises.
Exactly. And they're also investing in new equipment and technologies that are specifically designed for Arctic conditions.
Like icebreakers and snowmobiles.
Right. And they're also developing new tactics and doctrines for fighting in the Arctic.
It's a whole new frontier for them.
It is, and one that they're taking very seriously.
Okay, so before we move on to the future of the Russian military, I want to touch on one more thing. Coastal defense. You mentioned that earlier. What are some of the systems they're using to protect their coastline?
Well, they have a layered approach to coastal defense. They have land-based missile systems, like the Ball and Bastion systems.
What are those capable of?
Well, the Ball system fires KH-35 anti-ship missiles, which have a range of about 120 kilometers.
That's a pretty long reach.
It is. And then the Bastion system fires Onyx missiles, which have a range of over 300 kilometers.
Wow, that's a serious weapon.
It is. And they're also developing more unconventional systems, like the Club K containerized missile system.
Containerized, what does that mean?
It means that the missiles are hidden inside ordinary shipping containers, which can be transported by truck rail or even ship.
So they can basically pop up anywhere.
It can, and that makes them very difficult to target.
So it's a very mobile and stealthy system.
It is, and it's a real game changer in naval warfare.
I can see why other countries are worried about it.
They are. It's a very effective weapon system, and it's a good example of how the Russians are thinking outside the box when it comes to military technology.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from tanks and artillery to cyber warfare and Arctic operations. What's the big takeaway? What's the future of the Russian military?
Well, I think the future of the Russian military is all about modernization and innovation. They're trying to catch up to the West in terms of technology.
So what are some of the key areas they're focusing on?
Well, they're investing heavily in things like network-centric warfare, artificial intelligence, and autonomous systems.
Those are some pretty big buzzwords. Break it down for me. What does that actually mean?
Okay, so network-centric warfare is all about connecting sensors, shooters, and decision makers in a seamless network, so you can share information and make decisions more quickly.
I see. So it's like creating a digital battlefield where everyone's on the same page.
Right. And then artificial intelligence is about using computers to do things that normally require human intelligence, like analyzing data, identifying targets, and even making decisions.
So they're trying to automate warfare.
In a way, yes. And then autonomous systems are things like drones and unmanned ground vehicles that can operate without direct human control.
So basically robots.
Pretty much. They see these technologies as force multipliers. They can extend their reach, reduce casualties, and make their forces more effective overall.
It's a bit unsettling to think about war being fought by machines.
I know, but it's the direction things are headed.
Yeah.
And the Russians are determined to be at the forefront of this technological revolution.
Okay, so we talked earlier about their emphasis on modularity in their equipment. How does that fit into this vision of the future?
Well, the Armada platform is a great example of that. It's a universal chassis that can be adapted for a variety of roles, from tanks to infantry fighting vehicles to self-propelled artillery.
So it's like a Lego set for armored vehicles.
Yeah, kind of. You can mix and match components to create the perfect vehicle for the mission.
That's pretty cool. And it sounds like they're applying that same modular thinking to their weapons systems as well.
Their new Kaliber cruise missile, for example, can be launched from ships, submarines, aircraft, and even ground launchers.
So it's a very versatile weapon.
It is. And they're also developing hypersonic weapons, which travel at speeds greater than Mach 5.
Hypersonic weapons. I've heard about those. They're supposed to be incredibly difficult to intercept.
They are. They could potentially change the balance of power in certain regions.
So the Russians are definitely pushing the envelope when it comes to military technology.
They are. And they're showing no signs of slowing down.
Okay, so we talked about their focus on modernization. Now let's talk about the Arctic. Why is the Arctic becoming so important for them?
Well, the Arctic is a region of growing strategic importance. There are vast reserves of oil and natural gas up there, and as the ice melts, it's opening up new shipping lanes.
I see. So it's about resources and access.
Right. And the Russians see the Arctic as their backyard. They have a long history in the region, and they're determined to protect their interests there.
So they're building new bases, deploying troops, conducting exercises.
They are. They're also developing new equipment and technologies that are specifically designed for Arctic conditions.
So they're taking it very seriously.
They are, and they're not alone. Other countries like the United States and Canada are also increasing their military presence in the Arctic.
It sounds like a new Cold War is brewing up there.
It's definitely a potential flashpoint, but hopefully things won't escalate to that level.
Fingers crossed. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. What's the big takeaway? What does it all mean?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that the Russian military is a force to be reckoned with. They're modernizing rapidly, they're developing new technologies, and they're not afraid to use them.
So we shouldn't underestimate them.
Definitely not. They're a serious player on the world stage, and we need to understand their capabilities and their intentions.
That's a good point. So what's the best way to do that? How can we learn more about the Russian way of war?
Well, there are a lot of great resources out there, books, articles, reports. You can also follow experts on social media and listen to podcasts like this one.
Shameless plug. I like it. Well, I want to thank you for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating conversation.
It has, and thanks for having me.
To our listeners out there, I hope you found this deep dive informative and insightful. The Russian way of war is a complex and evolving topic, and it's one that we need to pay close attention to in the years to come